Hi, everyone. Welcome to our fifth webinar in our series, Energy Production and Human Health, Surveying Current Knowledge about Exposures from Unconventional Oil and Gas Development. This is a webinar series from HEI Energy, and our webinar today is about research fatigue and community exposure and health research. We have two speakers today. Here's today's agenda, just a brief introduction from me. I'm Anna Rozovsky. I'm a senior scientist at HEI. And then an overview of research fatigue by Katie Bills-Walsh from Cornell University. And then a talk about best practices for engaging communities by Julia Haggerty from Montana State University. And then a panel discussion at the end with Q&A. Just some logistics before we get started. All attendees are muted with no audio for the duration of the webinar. You can submit your questions via the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And you can upvote questions with which you want to that match your own question. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website in the next couple of weeks. If you experience any logistical difficulties, you can message the panelists via the chat function. And there'll also be a post-webinar survey that pops up on your screen, and you'll find the same survey that we'll send in a thank you email tomorrow. We would greatly appreciate if you filled out that survey. So just a little bit about HEI Energy. We're an independent nonprofit corporation chartered to provide policy relevant, high quality and impartial science. We're funded jointly by government and the oil and gas industry and occasionally by private foundations. We fund research that's selected, overseen and reviewed independently of those sponsors. The program is overseen by the Energy Research Committee, which is comprised of internationally recognized experts in one or more topics relevant to the research of this program, the focus of this program, which is unconventional oil and gas development, or UOGD. We funded our inaugural set of 5 studies that examine links between UOGD and potential community exposures through air and water in late 2021. You could find more information about those studies on our website. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Katie. So Dr. Katie Bills-Walsh is an environmental social scientist with expertise in natural resource management, energy geography, the social and environmental legacies of resource production, and stakeholder engagement. Katie recently transitioned from her role as a postdoctoral research social scientist with the Northern Plains Climate Hub at USDA ARS to the position of research associate at Cornell University Center for Conservation Social Sciences. And the floor is yours. Thank you, Katie.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for having me.
And Katie, we're seeing your presentation. You're in presentation mode, not the full screen.
I apologize that. How's that?
That's better.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm truly ecstatic to be here to share some work I did when I was a PhD student at Montana State University with Dr. Haggerty. And we'll be talking about human subjects research within a cyclical industry, which is the unconventional oil and gas industry. And in particular, looking at the possibility and potential for research fatigue in the rural communities that often are host to energy production sites. So this webinar, as Anna alluded to, is broken up into 2 parts. I'll take on the first part and then hand it off to Julia. So in my portion of this presentation, I will be sharing a study that we conducted to better understand the landscape of social and community impacts research within unconventional oil and gas development communities. So we wanted to better understand the type of research that was taking place, where it was occurring, the type of methods being used, and the ways communities were being engaged with to understand if there was potential for research fatigue and what we could do on our end to mitigate research fatigue. And that's where Julia's portion will come in, where we think through some best practices for engaging with communities, touch on some tools that we developed as part of our work for researchers to be prepared for engaging in communities, as well as a study of social scientists who conduct this work to understand the ways in which they approach community engagement. So a roadmap for my portion of today's webinar is to talk about how this project originated. I'll describe the project and its overall purpose, our methodology, and of course the findings. And then I'll pass it along to Julia to discuss best practices for engaging communities. So this work originated out of discussions in our lab group with Julia and colleagues and some other scientists that we collaborated often with in rural sociology and extension personnel about the potential for research fatigue amongst community members in the energy boom towns where we work in particular. So anecdotally, we were hearing from community members that they were exhausted and overwhelmed by the number of requests they received to participate in research from the academic community, but as well from the media and journalists who are interested in learning more about the local impacts of energy development within these small rural places. And when we think about research fatigue, we're using a specific definition about when individuals or groups become tired of engaging with research. And it's observable through a demonstration of reluctance towards continuing to engage with an existing project or an outright refusal to engage with any further research. And we can imagine that there's consequences to this. You know, social scientists trying to answer questions within these communities could run into some serious roadblocks if there's general unwillingness among potential participants to join and partake in the research process. So we wanted to better understand if the anecdotal stories and evidence that we were hearing on the ground was observable in the published literature. Because we did already know a little bit about research fatigue, that there are declining and really uneven, unpredictable survey response rates in both rural and urban communities. And there's consequences in terms of the research costs being higher, and it can also potentially threaten the validity of research findings if an adequate sample can't be recruited to participate in research. And although our work takes place in a specific type of community, largely rural, host of intense and rapid unconventional oil and gas development, we argue that the lessons we learned, the tools we developed, the ways in which we now approach research can apply across different geographies in the study of different questions in different content in different places. So we'll make a point to touch on the ways in which we can extrapolate what we learned into other contexts and geographies. And oftentimes when we're thinking about research fatigue, we hear about some practical challenges, like people don't have time to participate in research, and that's one of the contributing factors to their research fatigue or reluctance to participate. But other things like skepticism about research outcomes and apathy are far less frequently discussed in the literature and were something we were interested in learning more about. Because energy communities are really unique, especially in unconventional oil and gas contexts. We see that they experience two simultaneous booms. So this first boom is what we all kind of know of and understand to occur, which is a boom in industrial activity, increased truck traffic and construction and infrastructure development that's all associated with unconventional oil and gas extraction. But then there's a second boom taking place, which is a boom in attention from outsiders. These are academics and researchers, journalists, consultants, policymakers, all eager to understand the local impacts of unconventional oil and gas development. So a community can be challenged in these different dimensions. They're seeing a lot of landscape change, a change in the use and demand for services, but also in requests for their time and expertise and communication about their experiences, which together can put strain on a community. And we didn't want to be part of that strain. We wanted to be really thoughtful and mindful about the way that we were pursuing our research, because we know that as social scientists, we don't want to unwittingly contribute to sets of burdens or risks on communities that are already facing a lot of change. We don't want to be just another newcomer coming in, asking sets of questions and demanding people's time. We don't want to compound psychological and physical stress on community members that already may be feeling some strain amidst the change that's been taking place. So we aimed to do this work to help inform an ongoing conversation among scholars who study the energy impacts within a community setting so that we could set future research priorities and importantly, really form a dialogue about the potential benefits of coordinating our work so that we're not being redundant, we're not over researching particular places or people, and making sure that we're acting equitably in the type of research that we're pursuing and our treatment of potential research participants. So there was a large group of collaborators who worked together on this project, of which the component that is making up my talk today is a part. And it was myself, Dr. Haggerty at Montana State, and other researchers across different geographies and disciplines. And this part of the project sought to do a systematic survey of all the research that had been published on the social and community impacts of shale gas development in the United States. So we wanted to know the size, composition, and character of human subjects research. We wanted to know the temporal and geographical distribution of the research that had been published so far, and also how the authors of these publications, the researchers themselves, interact with community members and approach community engagement in their research. So to do this, we built a literature database through a multimodal search. We searched for every single publication that reported on the social or community impacts of unconventional oil and gas development in the United States using methods that pursued human subjects. So surveys, interviews, focus groups, and participant observation or ethnography. And we built this database of 198 publications. So from the year 2000 to April 2018. And these 198 publications contain 167 isolated data collection events. So there's a slight discrepancy in these numbers because sometimes one particular data collection event, like one survey, informs two publications, or someone who wrote their dissertation then published a peer-reviewed article. So we wanted to make sure to count the data collection events discretely in that way to make sure that we were doing a real accurate portrayal of the research that had taken place between 2000 and 2018. So in total, this literature database includes 32 theses, 41 dissertations, and 125 scholarly journal articles from 70 journals. We were not able to include book chapters, and review articles were also excluded. And after we collected all of that literature, all 198 published theses, dissertations, or journal articles, we read them all, and we systematically coded them for specific information. Myself and a team of excellent undergraduate researchers helped to read and code every single article for specific data. The study location, where was this study in terms of its location, all the way down to the county level. So we tried to get as specific as possible with where the studies took place. What was the study methodology in terms of where our surveys deployed, focus groups, interviews, some combination of methods. We also were interested in who was being targeted, what participants were being sought to include in the study. This helps us to better understand if there's particular groups that are being over-researched or under-researched. And lastly, the ways in which researchers approached community engagement, as much as it was reported within the publications themselves. And I'll start with kind of the final takeaway. In the survey of all of this literature, we deduced that some locations and individuals that are associated with unconventional oil and gas development may very well be at risk and/or may have already experienced research fatigue. And in those 167 isolated data collection events that are reported within our publications database, over 25,000 people participated in shale impacts research by sitting for an interview, participating in a focus group, responding to a survey. So a huge amount of people have been reached and have participated thus far. And now if we think geographically about where this work has been done, we see that there's a pretty uneven geographical distribution of research. So these are the energy plays, the energy resource geological formations, and the data collection events by formation. So we see by a huge margin, the Marcellus Shale has been studied 3 times as much as any other basin. So the Marcellus, which is in Pennsylvania, Ohio, into West Virginia, has hosted 89 data collection events itself, with some other formations also being pretty well studied. The Bakken, North Dakota into eastern Montana, Wyoming's Powder River Basin, northern Colorado's Niobrara, and to a lesser extent, the Barnett and Eagle Ford shales in Texas. And if we look at this data portrayed a little bit differently, over half of all data collection has occurred within the Marcellus Shale of Pennsylvania. So we're seeing a real disproportionate amount of research taking place in this particular geography. And there might be a couple reasons why that happens: proximity of large research universities and things like that. But it is an important data point. Again, the aim of this research was to start conversations among our colleagues to set future research priorities. And this information helps us to have a really informed conversation about doing that. And like I said, when we read each one of these publications, we coded for the location in which the research occurred, all the way down to the county level. So we see the top 4 most heavily researched counties are in Pennsylvania. Then the first being Bradford County, Pennsylvania, which has hosted 20 data collection events. And you see, we've also included here just some contextual information, the population in the year 2010. So Bradford County hosting 20 data collection events. Their population is just under 63,000 people. This starts to paint a picture. We can imagine how, with this amount of data collection taking place, with such a small population to potentially sample for, that there may be potential for research fatigue. And I want to draw your attention to now the counties ranked 8th, and particularly the last county, McKenzie County, North Dakota, hosted 5 data collection events, but their population is just over 6,000 people. I actually ran the numbers and found that 10% of the population has either participated in an interview, a focus group, or responded to a survey. So we can imagine that many more have been contacted. And this helps us to understand and kind of start to inform conversations about the potential for research fatigue, the ways in which we can do our best to mitigate strain in communities and target our research to places that maybe haven't seen as much activity and where there are unanswered questions. And when thinking about the Marcellus, there's this piece about timing, which is important when we're thinking about the potential strain on communities. And I'll walk us through this graph here, which shows in blue bars the number of rigs operating. So this is a proxy for kind of the boom bust nature, the level of industrial activity that was happening at a given time. And we see that between 2009 through 2011, this real increase in rig count. So this was when the development in the area was at its peak, was really growing and heightening. And in orange, what we see is the number of data collection efforts. So what we see is they mirror each other in some ways. As rig count was increasing and industrial activity was growing, so too were the number of research activities taking place. And again, we see research peak in about 2013 and 14, right after the height of activity. And this is because we do know that there's some lag time between when data is collected and eventually published. But what this does is draw our attention to the idea that at the times in which these communities are changing the most in terms of industrial activity and landscape change is also potentially a time when there's multiple social scientists in the community in search of research participants. And together, that could be potentially overwhelming for potential research participants. We'll move on from the geography to talk about the methods that were used. So in 46% of all the data collection events reported within these publications, interviews were held. And we know that interviews require a huge amount of effort and time on the part of the participant. They have to, pass on any other obligations and sit with the interviewer and respond to their questions. So this is a particular method that requires a lot of time, and often some coordination and logistical discussions beforehand too. In a quarter of all work, surveys were conducted, followed by participant observation and ethnography, which was often coupled with another method. And then focus groups and stakeholder meetings or workshops were done on occasion. I'll walk us through this. This is the research methods that were used, specifically the interviews by geography. So we have the formations. So we see number one is the Marcellus, the states in which those formations are located, and the number of data collection events that occurred within that formation here that used interviews. So in the Marcellus, that was 45. And the number of interviews conducted was 1,257. So when we look at all the interviews conducted in all of the studies across these geographies, 3,261 people have sat for an interview. And we know how time intensive that is. And we also want to be cognizant of who we're asking to participate in these interviews when thinking about the potential for fatigue, strain on services, and on people's time. Next is survey efforts. So again, this chart's organized in a similar way. We're looking at the formations under study, the states in which they're located, and the number of data collection efforts within those formations that use surveys. So for the Marcellus, that was 26. In those 26 surveys, 12,604 people responded with an average response rate of 39%. And you'll see next to that in parentheses that the N there is equal to 19. And that's because in a couple of the publications, it didn't share with us what the response rate was. So 19 of those 26 data collection efforts had data on their response rate. So that was our best attempt at capturing response rates. And we do know that across all geographies, just over 21,000 people have responded to surveys. But who are those people? And now we'll move into this final piece, which is thinking about the stakeholders and the stakeholder groups and who's being targeted to participate in the work that we're doing. The first is a really broad category of community residents, so not necessarily landowners, but residents who call that community home. And in the second category is community leaders, local government officials, people associated with the Chamber of Commerce, things like that. And they're one of the most common targets for data collection. They have a huge amount of expertise and a couple different vantage points in which they're experiencing the change in their community that they can then comment on. And what our data set does is suggest that there's a really strong possibility that some of these community leaders are shouldering significant research participation demands. They're being asked to participate quite often, and part of that is due to their expertise, but also that their contact information like emails and phone numbers can usually be easily found online. And this is also slightly problematic in the context in which this work is being done, which is in rural communities where already there's a pretty big strain on local government personnel and services are a little bit thin. So the additional demands already on their time as a result of their employment, we can imagine that outside requests could be really difficult to field. And as part of our coding effort, we also wanted to understand if the authors ever mentioned challenges associated with recruitment, because we knew if we heard within the publications that there were recruitment challenges, that would be connected to some sort of research fatigue within their study sites. And there was a couple themes that emerged. Authors reported that they had difficulty obtaining industry participation, that sometimes there was assumptions about a researcher's positionality or just a general skepticism about taking part in the research. There's a lack of trust in researchers, and due to the divisive nature of unconventional oil and gas development in some of these study locations, a general reluctance to participate in research about a somewhat sensitive and controversial activity. And that there was also, people communicated they had trouble recruiting participants because those participants were very busy, but also that there's this amount of turnover that happens in employment, which is very characteristic of energy boom towns, which can make it really difficult to connect with the folks that you're interested in targeting. And one particular article kind of summed this up really well. McCann said, roughly 50% of the individuals approached declined to participate in the study for various reasons, including wanting to fiercely protect their identities despite ensured confidentiality, distrust of individuals from different social contexts, and residual feelings of resentment and exploitation by outside individuals who merely report the events disrupting the community without actually contributing in a socially viable way. So this feeling that we heard anecdotally as we drafted the proposal for this project and embarked on it, which was we field a lot of requests from researchers and journalists, we contribute our time and we respond and participate, and then we don't hear from those people again. So we're unsure how our participation is contributing to any real change. And I'll end with this because it's a great segue into Julia's piece, which is we also wanted to understand how community engagement was being conducted by researchers in this space. And within the literature database, only 11% of studies indicated any community engagement was carried out at all. And in our survey of researchers who conduct social science work within these communities, we found when we asked them how they share their results, that they almost always share their results in academic settings by producing peer-reviewed articles or presenting results at a conference. And much more seldom are they committed to presenting results in the community through outreach or through presentations. And part of this is a function of the academy, which I think Julia will touch on next. I want to acknowledge a few folks, the USDA who funded this work, USDA NIFA, my previous affiliation at MSU and in Julia's Resources and Communities Research Group. Please jot down my contact information. I'm happy to chat anytime, and I'm looking forward to Julia's piece in the Q&A. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Katie. That was really interesting. And we had some really interesting questions come in. We'll save some of them for the Q&A. And Julia, thanks for answering some of them in the meantime. And just want to remind everyone to please add your questions to the Q&A if you have them. So I'm going to hand it over to Julia. Dr. Haggerty is an associate professor of geography in the Department of Earth Sciences at Montana State University. She teaches courses in human, economic, and energy resource geography at MSU and leads the Resources and Communities Research Group there. She has expertise in diverse rural geographies, including those shaped by energy development, extractive industries, ranching and agriculture, and amenity development and conservation. Partnerships and collaboration with diverse stakeholders are central to her approach. And Julia, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks so much. Everybody hear me okay?
We can, yep.
Okay, great. So thanks everyone for being here, and thanks Katie for a great introduction. It's so fun to be back together again. Great introduction to this work, but I do want to acknowledge the HEI Energy team. I think this is really an important conversation, so I'm so glad to be here and contribute to it. In my talk, what I'd really like us to do is to start to shift into a conversation kind of about what to do with some of this information. So I'll try to be conversational, and in fact, we're going to put you on the spot to answer a few questions that we've organized by a Zoom poll. If you're on the phone, sorry, you'll have to just speak up later, but you'll see those poll questions coming through. And what I do want to acknowledge is that the work that we are presenting on really is work that is largely conducted outside of the health impact space. And it occurred to me while Katie was talking that some of you might be quite worried that we're not including health impacts in our definition of kind of community impacts. That's only because we live in a different world. We study social impacts, economic impacts, as do most of our colleagues in sociology, anthropology, geography. And of course, health concerns are very much part of the overriding community sets of issues. So we don't mean to exclude those, and we're excited to be part of a conversation here. But I will say that I think we're all going to have to challenge ourselves in this conversation to think about how the recommendations that we've made, primarily focused on people who go to communities to collect data, what we would call kind of qualitative or quantitative survey data, which might be a little different than the data that you're collecting. So we've developed recommendations for that community. We think they're probably relevant to a lot of you, but we don't make any assumptions that that's the case. So challenge us, challenge yourselves to think about, okay, how can we use this? And are the recommendations that I'm going to offer of any use to you? So we're really excited about the interchange. We hope you'll, shut off the email that you've been doing on the side and focus here now on a conversation with all of us. So in terms of what I'd like to cover, I am going to just continue on this theme of thinking about who local stakeholders are and what their needs and priorities might be. And I'll just, again, focus on what we learned now, not talking about the broader survey that we've done, but in, over a decade of working in energy host communities. And then I'll talk a little bit about what some of the kind of key principles we think should guide engagement with communities. And then I'll introduce you to a couple of tools that we have to help you think about applying these best practices. So what I want to start with is a poll question. Anna, if you can pull this one up. So we'd just like to know what's going on with you. Do you interact with the people in the communities you study? And if so, in which context? And we'll just give you, Anna, we didn't talk about how much time for answering poll questions, but we'll just give you a minute to answer those.
Yeah.
And that poll should have come up in a kind of separate dialog box within your overall Zoom framework.
Yeah, I'll let you know when responses start slowing down.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll.
Okay. Thanks so much, people, for trying out this way of engaging with us. We do have people on the call who are interacting with people face to face, people who are collecting remote data. We have some community leaders. So all of you are important stakeholders in this, and it's great to kind of know who's here. And I think we'll be interested in the questions that you bring to this. Okay, so I'm going to switch now to talking about who local stakeholders are. This is from a 2015 CRS report, and we just use this number to remind people. So 74% of onshore oil, this is just oil produced in the US, involve non-federal resources. Why does this matter? This matters because when there is a federal process for developing natural resources, there will be a formal environmental impact statement. For better or for worse, that environmental impact statement might include social and economic impacts. But once oil and gas development is happening outside of federal purview, the landscape for impact assessment is much more scattered. And you all probably know this as health impacts experts. So what we in our research group were really interested in during the shale boom was thinking about how communities were identifying impacts and responding to them, largely in this space where regulation was at best piecemeal, and at worst, had sort of big holes and gaps in it when it comes to mandating impact assessment that would both identify impacts to communities and mitigate them. So we started from this, we began to see that during the shale boom, impact monitoring and mitigation was really do it yourself. And so our research was really understanding whether or not that was, we come from a community resilience standpoint, whether that was engendering processes that enhanced community resilience or kind of detracted from it. And like good social scientists, we've really found that the results were very mixed, really depended on local context. But in this work, we met a lot of local stakeholders who were really active in thinking about impacts to their communities from shale development. And I want to just introduce you to one to kind of ground our conversation and give you a sense of kind of who some of these local stakeholders were. So one of the places that we've worked a lot over the years is called Richland County. The county seat is the town of Sydney. This is way out in eastern Montana, and it's on the western edge the Bakken region. So if you're from not from the United States, the Bakken region is this big interior shale play that has that was really kind of one of the most important regions in reversing U.S. oil dependence and really liberating a lot of shale oil. And of course, there was a lot of co-produced gas. It's a super rural region, very few people, large land area, lots of challenging public service kind of issues. So Richland County, where we worked, is a service center and a population hub servicing the Bakken. Even though most of the development was in North Dakota, there was also development over in Montana and a lot of workers going back and forth. So just to give you a sense of kind of who some of the local stakeholders were, this is a group of people in Richland County who were sort of single-handedly, I would say, leading the local impact response. They are called Communities in Action, and actually what they used was a public health planning process, which is a planning process designed to identify public health needs and allocate resources efficiently by bringing together all different kinds of local stakeholders in a community. So in this picture, you have teachers, you have faith leaders, you have public health officials, you have local government officials, you have potentially some state agency folks. And they're not only thinking about public health, they're really thinking about all the impacts that occur in their community. And so we've written about this group. We think they were really inspiring, but I want you to think about them as the everyday people that might be interacting with researchers and with research results, because they really care about addressing impacts that happen in their community. And what I would say as a very general rule is that when we think about this group, and in fact, the very reason that Communities in Action existed is because there is just this tremendous need to respond to all of the very many local service demands that come with any kind of intensive development. And so local advocates, leaders, even many citizens in places that are experiencing intensive industrial development, whether that's oil and gas development or other kinds of industry, the stakeholders in research often are wearing very many hats. They're often very stressed particularly during that period of rapid growth and rapid expansion. They are very interested in work that helps them identify and respond to local concerns. So research that is meaningful to them, not surprisingly, is going to probably be better well received and something that they are more able to kind of wrap their minds around and get excited about. One perspective we have is that all of these people are experts in their communities and need to be treated as such. And then, as Katie mentioned in her framing comments, certainly our work in these places confirms the idea that many local stakeholders in research in energy impacts really aren't sure who to trust. And one really interesting thing that we might talk about in the question and answer session is just the legacy that's been left in many oil and gas communities from working with industry and to some extent state regulators as well, and feeling somewhat burned by that process and really having even fewer, even less confidence in experts or other representatives who are coming from outside to their community. So this question of who can I trust to provide me reliable information about impacts that are happening in my community and actionable information, that's a really pervasive and persistent question, and one that I think really persists past the boom phase into the production phase and even the legacy phase of development. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is just a quick poll to see how we're doing. Do the things that I just described in terms of people you interact with in communities, do you imagine that they affect those people as well? So are people you're interacting with characteristically wearing very many hats? Are they worried about who to trust? Do they need to see research that's meaningful to them, not always sure how things are meaningful to them? These are some of the themes that we've identified here. So just a quick poll to see, how that lands with all of you. Okay, so interestingly, those who are responding see a lot of parallels and similarities. So that's good. That's important, and hopefully, some of these tools then that we'll talk about will feel relevant. So let's shift now to thinking about how we have encouraged our broader community to think about engaging with energy impacted communities. And as I'll do this, what I'll say is I'm getting towards some concrete set of tools that came out of this research fatigue project that Katie mentioned. And one of the things that we identified first in developing these tools is just some overarching principles for how you might organize your thinking and your approach when it comes to interacting with communities that host intensive industries. So we think about 4 overarching principles, and what I'm going to do is describe each of those principles, and then I want to go through and just provide an example of ways we've operationalized those principles in our work. And you'll see in this, for those of you who are familiar with community-based or participatory action research, or other, sort of decolonizing principles in research, you'll see things in here that are that come from that work and are translated so that sort of any user can pick them up and make sense of them. So Katie mentioned how important we have found communication among researchers to be. And that's just about this issue that happened where there was a lot of research that was sort of replicating itself, but not actually directly comparable, because there was a lot of small case studies using different methods. And our sense in reading all of that is that better coordination at the start of the shale boom really would have yielded potentially less negative impacts to communities, and potentially even, sort of more high impact research. A second principle that we bring into our work is thinking about really being flexible. Is certainly research design needs to be rigorous and well thought out, but modifying research approaches along the way as local needs are surfaced is something that is a really key principle, and I'll show an example of that. Then engaging with communities, we have come to feel, and this particularly comes from the findings that Katie mentioned, and then our own experiences working in the field, that many communities never see the results of research that is conducted using their data or their information. So planning ways to share results back with communities and thinking creatively about what that might look like is a really important principle. And then finally, we really encourage an ethical discussion and set of considerations within the research team and with research stakeholders that we think goes beyond the standard IRB kind of process. And this is really about sitting down and recognizing that there is a risk that research can be extractive. And there's also a very positive opportunity for research to be constructive in communities, and thinking about how that might work should be part of the research design process. So let me just give you a few quick examples. So in terms of coordinating with other researchers, we were fortunate to receive funding from the National Science Foundation. This is Jeffrey Jaquette and myself, and then a sort of similar group of folks, to do a research coordination network, which was really about getting researchers who are working in shale impacted communities to talk to each other. We did this in a big conference in 2017, but now we just run a Google list or Google group, and that network continues to share results, continues to help us identify upcoming grad students that are doing new research. They can reach out to this group. They can ask what's been done in other places. So something as simple as a listserv is a great way to get researchers that might be working out with communities to talk to each other. But certainly there are many other approaches and ways to think about doing this. So as an example of kind of modifying research as you go, in the case of the work that we did out in Eastern Montana on a different grant, we were really interested in these local impact mitigation processes, and we asked to study community in action. And when we asked, what would be in it for them, it turned out they really needed a program evaluation. So this is a great opportunity for my students to learn the practice of program evaluation, and for us to deliver a report that was actually based on the same data that we used to write academic papers, about how do community institutions, monitor and mitigate oil and gas impacts, but also deliver a report that was something that the Communities in Action group needed and used in their further strategic planning. And that's something that wasn't written into the grant, but was pretty easy to deliver and to adjust our research process to do. Second from last, going and sharing results, we think is incredibly important. I think given everything that is happening in the world, to the degree that it's possible for this to happen in person, I just don't think we can overstate the value that we see, at least in rural communities, of local leaders being visited by researchers just to say, hey, here's our work. We'd love to share it with you in whatever form you like. It could be conversations with individuals. It could be conversations over the kitchen table. It could be formal presentations in county commission meetings, but it's more than just logging the paper. It is really about the relational aspect of this. And I'm sure many people in the audience have much more creative ways to think about sharing information. But again, one thing to do is just ask local stakeholders how they would like to receive this information. The in-person piece, I think, really has so many benefits. And then finally, I mentioned the importance of a really thorough ethical approach. One example that I'm working on right now comes out of all of my experience working in the shale world, which is that we have a new energy justice project working with the Crow tribe in Montana, where we're exploring how the coal transition is impacting public services and social vulnerability to an already very vulnerable population. We have spent over a year developing an ethics protocol as a collaborative process, and our ethics protocol is now a handbook for the research team. And again, it goes much farther than what's required either by a tribal IRB or by our own institutional IRBs. And it has things in it like not only all of the protocol, but it has overarching descriptions of what is the goal of this research from the perspective of the community. How should we behave in our interpersonal interactions? So it's really about a deliberative dialogue about how this research can be non-extractive and what the expectations are from the community about how they want to engage with researchers. And what, in fact, that reminds me that one point I really want to emphasize for those of you who are community leaders is that there's also an opportunity, a challenge, a piece of work that needs to happen on the community end, which is really to coordinate within the community about what research priorities there are, how the community wants to hear from researchers. And I think there's ways that through funding and through researchers' prompts, those conversations can be facilitated and encouraged. Okay, so I'll leave you now just with some tools that we've developed. And what I want to know first is just our final poll. If you've seen some of these examples of best practices, what some of the principles are, of course, there's many different ways you could apply these principles. I'm curious to know from all of you, Anna, if you can throw that poll up, whether or not the workflow in your discipline is going to accommodate some of these best practices. Again, it might not look exactly like this, but I'm curious about what your perceptions are about how doable this is. Okay, so this is interesting, and what I'm going to switch to in a minute is some of one summary slide from some work we did to ask researchers the same question as part of the research fatigue project. And you can see that not every discipline has, our set of practices really has a clear path for working in this way. It may not need one, but certainly we have observed, I'm going to go ahead and close this. Thank you for your answers. we have observed, so this is a paper that came from the sort of second piece of the work that Katie discussed, was actually interviewing the social science research community about their experiences. And we did this through a survey, a set of focus groups, and then a survey with oil and gas researchers. And the citation to this is here. But what you can see is that, as Katie showed in her final slide, there are many people that aren't sharing research back with communities. And some of the barriers that have been identified are probably barriers that might be familiar to you. That is a lack of time, a lack of money by that stage of the research. Often, our results aren't ready until the grant is finished, and then we're on to other things, maybe not going back to the community. It's not always clear the community is interested. I know we've had times where we've gone back to share results and only 3 people show up at the library. So it's not always clear there's like a ton of community interest. Does your employer or supervisor see a value in this? And is there even a good forum? How would you go back to the community to deliver that? So we can talk about that, some of those obstacles, and whether or not you've experienced them and what some of the workarounds might be in our discussion. But so I do want to just highlight that there are some very specific kind of practical tools that we've developed from this work. And what they are is an online course and then a workbook and planning guide. And what we wanted to do was just encourage there to be the possibility to incorporate some of this thinking into curricula and into planning at the early stages of research. So one of the key audiences for this work were early career, or even, upper division graduate students who are thinking about planning research projects. So we have an online course, which you see here. You can actually earn continuing education credits through Montana State University. And that's a 5-module course that is self-paced. It takes about maybe 3 hours to complete. But our hope was that, one thing that might be a consideration is, for example, for this to be an add-on module in the IRB training that a team of researchers is going to do, to go out and think about, that larger ethical kind of sets of engagements. So there's an online course we highly recommend. If you have questions about it, happy to talk about it. And then related to that is a workbook and planning guide. And this is really a nice tool developed by my colleague, Susie Taylor, who's an expert in science education. And this tool is designed to help a researcher think through all of these aspects of community engagement. So it has sets of questions, some worksheets, and it really is a nice tool to think about implementing at the early stages of research. So with that, I want to say thank you for listening, and I'm so excited for the conversation. I'm just going to say, to sort of actively listen back, my understanding is that we have an audience that is here because there are concerns potentially about research fatigue. You interact with communities, and you might be eager to think about using some of these approaches and tools, but it may not always be clear, whether or not that's possible to do. So with those kind of thoughts, we're happy to take Q&A, and Anna's going to moderate that. And I know there will be a great discussion. So thanks so much for your time, and thank you to our sponsors and to everyone for being here.
Thank you, Julia and Katie. Those were great talks, and we had some great questions come in. We also have a lot of our own questions, and I'm actually just gonna start with one that we had, which is, how can your guiding principles be used by researchers working with other communities, for instance, in urban areas? A lot of environmental health research focuses in urban areas, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you can extrapolate your work to research fatigue in other areas.
My guess is that the issues are not always so different. Simply because there's a higher density of people doesn't necessarily mean that there is any less kind of risk that the same people are being contacted, that there are trust concerns, that people might be oversampled or over-researched. A lot of the research fatigue literature actually comes from, kind of urban areas. So I think it's incumbent on the researchers engaging in these communities to ask just the question that you asked, Anna, which is like, to what degree do I see the signs? I think Katie gave a really good sense of like, what are some of the conditions that might lead to this? And my hunch is like, so one of the statistics we often use is collected by an extension professional in Minnesota. He says that in rural areas, rural people wear 4 times as many kind of volunteer hats as urban people. However, I think if you're talking about marginalized communities who are under-resourced in urban areas, that number is probably the same. So a single adult individual is volunteering at their church, they're on the PTA, they're doing some other kind of community service at levels of participation that exceed their peers in better served areas. So my hunch is that much of this is really very, very similar, but I'm curious to hear from the audience. And Katie, what would you add?
Yeah, I would echo that. And I think that chart that Julia presented with these like 4 kind of best practices really can be applied to different contexts and places. The idea of being flexible, that the work is driven by the place in which you're doing the work and the participants that you're communicating with, that you're behaving ethically and thinking carefully about the time demands and what could potentially benefit the communities in which you're working. Like that program evaluation that we produced that wasn't a part of our original research plan, but they shared with us that that was a product that would be really useful. And it was a way in which we could kind of just walk the walk and talk the talk of reciprocity, of really trying to be mindful of that. So I would just echo what Julia said, and the preparation and communication with community members and potential participants, and really letting that guide you, and having a sense also of the research that's been done in that area, reaching out to colleagues and connecting about their experiences so that you can feel really confident going into your study area, that you know the lay of the land and the way in which to communicate with the potential participants.
Yeah, so what I'm understanding is that you sort of have to tailor your approach based on the community or the subpopulation, that different communities don't experience research fatigue uniformly. Yeah. So we had a question which you answered briefly, but I want to revisit it. And that question is about, is there a national inventory of the research in the sector? And you mentioned the Shark database, Katie, and I'm going to put a plug in for our own databases. We have a spatial bibliography and publicly available literature database, but just more generally, I mean, so that's for research that already exists, but have you talked about ways in which people that have research ongoing in the same locations, or have research planned and were just funded, ways that they can communicate? I mean, anecdotally, we are constantly learning about research that's, air and noise and water monitoring research that is ongoing that could complement or overlaps the research that we funded. So I'm wondering if you've had those types of conversations.
I mean, certainly the Energy Impacts Network was an attempt to do that. It sort of hasn't succeeded, I think, obviously, Anna, for reasons, or not for reasons, but like in the sense that you still have these questions. My hope always was that the agencies who fund this work would take this seriously, because they are the point that all research proposals pass through. And so, I don't think we've made a strong enough effort maybe to reach out to program officers and know that things like a spatial bibliography are available, but also that it seems to me it would be relatively straightforward to begin to just pay attention to like, oh, this is happening in the same place, So I think the program officers who are funding this work are a really important node in the network, because all kind of information passes through them. Now, of course, there's many program officers in many agencies, but that's something that, a coordinating network could really, help kind of elevate and amplify the impact of that. So I think that's really important. And then I think some of it is like a bit of a culture shift, which is like we are, I think, protective of our research design until it's funded. I don't know, in the sector in which, HEI represents, which is sort of adjacent to academia, but not explicitly in academia. I don't know how much this is a problem. But, if you haven't sort of gotten the sense yet, like, I am very interested in like upending all of that because I think it's extremely wasteful of resources. So to the extent that people can invite others into their research design early, and really, see their work as complementary rather than like a race to publish first, on maybe identical data sets, like that's, from the perspective of communities, that kind of thing is pretty appalling. So I don't know if it's an issue in health impacts research, but I think some of it's just our own mindset about inviting each other into these dialogues early, not after projects have started. And okay, one last point. I also think this is where the kind of regional and community networks, could really be of assistance. Now, what is it in it for them? Partly it's just sort of better work for them and less inconvenience, but to the extent that there is a regional network that can say, hey, this is already happening, and a point of entry. I mean, we did see in the height of the shale boom that some communities would really designate a person who was kind of the community correspondent. Sometimes those people are funded by industry, and they would have, again, that kind of panoptical view of seeing everything that's happening and be able to bounce back to you as a researcher as you're getting started. Like, you really need to be in touch with these people at Oklahoma State who are also doing this.
Just a quick follow-up question. So you talked a lot about community leaders. You just mentioned them, Julia. Do you mind just defining what you consider a community leader so we're all on the same page?
Yeah, I mean, so community itself is a very contested word. We are really talking about geographically bounded places. So the residents and local elected officials, all the people that make a geographic place function, we recognize within that there are different kinds of communities and different levels of access to power and engagement and all that. What we see in the communities that we work with are that leaders exist across all sectors, but they tend to be the people who have a community-facing role as people who are advocating for well-being in their community, whether that's social, economic, environmental, others. So they're in churches, they're in NGOs, they're in local elected offices, all of those things.
Okay, so there are some questions here about community perception of, obviously, of researchers coming in. So one question is, communities want to understand impacts, but they also want to mitigate impacts. How do you deal with the question, okay, so what do we do about it? How much of research fatigue is associated with the research not leading to change?
I love this question. I think it's so important. I think there's a few things we can do, because you're right. A big piece of this is learning more about the impact so that something can be done about them. And what we've tried to do is, again, some of the things we've already touched on, share back results about what we found to be the most common challenges for communities, but also, be flexible in the way that we're approaching research. And I'll give an example. For a project in which we were doing, we had some structured components of conducting interviews and doing a large survey, but we also went to the communities and knew we needed to do case studies, but we didn't know of what yet. We weren't going to choose and then show up. We decided to do have some scoping conversations, do some participant observation, go to public meetings, and learn about what was the greatest challenge for the community and how our research could be in service of helping to provide some solutions. So we, again, let the community be our guide and learned about some ways in which they were working to mitigate impacts by coordinating across local governments, across counties, forming a coalition of landowners so that they could better understand what was taking place on their neighbors' property and how their neighbors were being affected, so they could negotiate more effectively with industry companies. And then we published that so that other communities could see these examples of the ways in which people were coordinating on a lot of different scales and in different ways to mitigate the impacts that they were facing. So that's one thing that came to mind. I don't know if, Julia, you have anything you'd like to add.
Well, I mean, I think this is a very profound question, and I suspect in the health impact space, it's even more vexing and worrying than it is, in the economic impacts, because you're really talking about people's like actual, physical material existence. And, my sense is that the health impacts are much bigger than are easily quantified, and they're very concerning. And it's really difficult to know what to do. I mean, I think that the best we can do is think about, what is the data that is going to really help mobilize, action. And then also just inventorying our own sets of choices about what we do and how we spend our time, to think about those. And I'm sure everyone at HEI Energy is really good at this, right? And already doing this, but like, what are those actions that I can take in the choices that I make about where I spend my time that are most directly going to influence this particular problem? And in many cases, it's a larger policy problem. But that's about, thinking about how do you train yourself to be more effective in those fora? How do you find avenues of influence in those fora? If you're an early career person, how do you ask your mentors to make space for that in your career? Those are personal choices, but they're ethical choices as well. And it's not, I don't think there's an easy answer. But I certainly, think that the more we ask those questions and the more we make choices guided by that framework, the greater our chance at some successes.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we deal with a lot in environmental health research is, investigator might find results that might indicate a problem in community that might be upsetting to the community, but it doesn't necessarily offer solutions. And I don't know if you've dealt with that in your work, and if you have any tips for handling that when doesn't necessarily offer solutions, mitigation solutions, or other decision-making solutions.
I mean, I would love to hear from this audience about how they have responded to that. I don't think we can add much to what we've already said, except for it would be really questionable to withhold research, right? So all you can do is share that back. And then I think all of the other ways that you can help support general community development so that community can be resilient to that set of issues, I think is important. But I'm really curious what this bigger audience has experienced along those lines, because I think it's an important dilemma you point out, Anna.
So Katie, I have some just specific questions about the research that you presented. So you talked about development or activity being a driver of more research being done in certain areas. Are there other causes or reasons why you think research might be happening in one area versus another? For example, like the presence of the university, or other things that investigators should be aware of when they're thinking about choosing their next study location?
Sure. I think, like I mentioned, presence of a university is kind of a natural, connection to make. I think, this is all educated guesses, but I would also say, in an area where it may be more controversial, it could attract more research attention, because the research can come from a different dimensions in terms of advocacy research, and in some other areas. I would also say that it is typical that at the time that research or industrial activity is really ramping up, there's more media attention and things like that, which then draws the attention of researchers to answer some questions and better understand local impacts at that time. And we do see this phenomenon that it's quite common that research increases as the level of industrial activity does. And then when there's a bust and industrial activity ceases, we see that researchers tend to abandon the location, not necessarily for somewhere else, but we just see a steady decline in research activity. So much so that, the idea of once production is ongoing or in a post-production phase, we see much less work being done. And we know that in this level of industrial activity causes landscape change, has long-term implications for community health and things like that. So another suggestion from this work is that we need to be mindful of when we're conducting the work, and that we're likely missing some pieces of this really kind of complicated timeline of industrial activity and community change by just focusing on one particular phase.
So in the research that you included, were they able to, did you find that they distinguished between different phases of development, or did they mostly discuss that they did this research at the very beginning?
My recollection is that for the most part, the research was done at the very beginning or into the production phase. We know there's that lag time in publication, with much fewer work, much less work being done in periods of decline. So it was, I've mentioned this a couple times in my responses in the Q&A box, that we were constrained by the amount of information the authors wrote in their publications. So sometimes it was challenging because we would have liked to been able to say more, but if they didn't include it in the publication, we were limited by that.
I mean, it's interesting to see what you were looking for and for future studies to put that type of information in their work.
Yeah, there could be a whole other paper we could write about methods and how we communicate our methods as researchers in this area.
Yeah. So are you, I'm going to step back a little bit. Are you aware of any case studies where researchers successfully avoided or overcame research fatigue?
A couple things come to mind. One is that, I think there are all sorts of good examples of kind of ground up projects, not ground up like hamburger, but like ground up projects, which, are largely community initiated. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. We evolve as a research community. And what I see happening now in the energy justice space is really like a next level of better practices in terms of like starting with community interests first. And there are, many examples of that. One project I would flag that I think is really influenced by this experience is Jeffrey Jaquette, my colleague here. Many of you probably know his work. He, like many of us, is now studying kind of the decline period, and particularly is working in coal communities in Appalachia. These are communities with all sorts of, endemic kind of health inequality and health inequities and economic inequity and all those kinds of things. They're being exacerbated by the energy transition. They have really taken an approach that is not, I would call it kind of, let's say, how do we take this experience of documenting impacts from the transition and turn it into a kind of community-led inquiry. And one of the main things they're doing right now is a whole lot of art and oral history and storytelling, which is about kind of empowering community voices, even sort of prior to any analysis. So there was they collaborated with Extension, but also brought in theater experts, art experts. There's a big photojournalism study that's going to be on display at Ohio State in the end of August. And this to me is like an example of really thinking out of the box in terms of, what is it that's going to help communities kind of have buy-in to like really exploring and talking about these issues. And you really do need that interdisciplinary team. And I did want to just mention a couple of things that have come up in the Q&A that are related to this. So one was just the question of like, do you need a, community engagement expert on your team? I think you could probably answer that question yourself, which is like, am I able to do this, or do I really need help? I think and then there's different levels of help. There's sort of like a consultant here and there. There's somebody really on the team. I think if you're asking these questions, I guess I would say like, have you, all of you, when was the last time, and this isn't like, I want to say this in a very like encouraging, like supportive way. Did you sit down for coffee with someone and say like, how can my research be most useful to you? I'm not saying that is like, has to happen everywhere, but just those relational conversations, you might they might be super awkward. You might not know what's going to come next. but they are like, that's the most basic way of sort of like asking, what kind of resources do I need to do this well? I mean, I think we're so trained to be like such precise experts in our science and the way we do things that we might forget that just kind of like treating people like, other fellow human beings in a conversation is like, gets us a long way there. And this is somewhat related to the wonderful physical scientist who wrote in discussing some like ambivalence about this, which is like, okay, I'm being told to interact with communities. Now I'm being told there's a risk that I'm burdening communities. Like, come on, give me a break here. And I think that's totally fair. In my own work, my experience interacting particularly with physical scientists is like, this is like, it's like not necessarily necessary to their research. It is a big ask. That said, I think it goes back to this idea of like, let's not imagine what's useful to the community. Let's ask them first. And I want to just say there's all sorts of research that can take place in places, can involve human subjects that they don't necessarily need, to know about. I think it's just about that deliberation of like, how do I avoid this being extractive? Is there a piece of this that could be useful? And letting the stakeholders in that research say what that is instead of guessing. And so as long as that process, that deliberative, appreciative inquiry is happening with stakeholders, like you could go wrong, but like, I think that's the most important piece, honestly. And so like, okay, one last comment on that. Like, I do think we've done ourselves a major disservice with the broader impacts, kind of push I don't know what it's like at NIH, but in NSF, like a lot of that is just researchers like sit at the last minute and dream up some stuff. And, when I review things, I'm quite critical of that. Like, I think, like, let's not burden communities with some idea that a funder says, like, you got to go out to the community. And so funders, if you're on this call, or other reviewers, you have to ask if these plans represent a community voice about how they want to be interacted with, rather than just like something we dreamt up in our office of this might be cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a relevant conversation now because there's a huge push for CBPR and environmental justice research that involves communities. And I think that's why I think this conversation is so timely, because researchers really have to consider that. I mean, that type of engagement can't just be where you're saying superficial. It needs to think about it and do the research ahead of time. So we have some new questions from the audience, and I'm just going to read the full question here. I think it's an interesting framing. So the issue of possible generalizability of the experience of research fatigue in shale communities is very important. This respiratory epidemiologist says they're having a continuing decreasing trend in participation rate in general population studies. We think that this may be due to continuing loss of individual feeling and a sense of community, the trust of public authorities, and excessive worry of privacy issues, which is perhaps enhanced by social media. So what are your thoughts on that in engaging communities and community work?
This is a great question, and just important for all of us to think about. And it has been written about some. The End of the Research World as We Knew It, which is written by Stedman, is a really interesting piece to start with, and can go in a lot of different directions. But I think this is very true, and we've dealt with it in some of our own research, is this, again, that piece that I said is not well researched yet, this apathy, the lack of trust in research outcomes and in research universities, and this increasing divisiveness, which can sometimes lead to people making assumptions about your positionality as a researcher and how you're approaching the work. And again, the privacy issues. And this reminds me of the quote that I read that came directly from that one article, which really touched on each piece of this question. And I think, what we can do to combat it is do a lot of what Julia said in terms of best practices of engaging with communities and being really, approaching it with appreciative inquiry, being really upfront and forthcoming. I think, something that like seems really obvious, but doing what you say you're going to do is a really big piece of this. If you say, I'll get back to you and share the results, get back to them and share the results, because you don't want to be contributing to someone's assumptions about the way research is being conducted and shared or withheld or anything like that. So I think those are some of the strategies we've employed. And, as a researcher, just being really open to the concerns of the participants and the stakeholders you're communicating with, even if it's not something you've heard of before, or, I've sat at some kitchen tables and had some really interesting conversations. And I think it's important to let down your guard and be open to those conversations. Even as Julia said, it might feel a little awkward. You don't know what's necessarily going to come your way, but even if after sitting down at that kitchen table, I got up and said, what the heck did we just talk about? I know that I was a person representing a university that was sitting at their table and listening. And if I didn't get anything else out of that interview, I knew that that was time well spent.
And I would just add to Giovanni's lovely observation that, so we were like, the shale boom largely happened in, I would say, like the world where truth was still like on the table. And so you're right, like so much has changed, authoritarian populism that was in part, I think, like fueled by some of the experiences, of particularly these rural places with resource regimes that are really disempowering to them. Like it definitely exploded those sort of misinformation networks. So I would just point to, like, there is a lot of new research right now. People are looking at, the role of social media in how people are responding to new energy development projects. And Katie's, one of Katie's collaborators at Cornell, Rich Stedman, has written, some of his students are now writing about the legacy of mistrust that is associated with the shale boom. So that mistrust that is seeded by interactions, with industry and their subcontractors, and to some degree, as I said before, with regulators, that is now, a cultural attribute of the landscape, which is going to affect how people engage with, invitations to participate in surveys, invitations to participate in meetings, all those things. I don't know what we want to call it. Like, it's a cultural legacy, but it's also about kind of community health. And it's maybe an outcome that I think we'll see more writing about as people write about the production phase and they start to look at, like, what has really happened in these communities. And it just reminds me, there's a framework in environmental sociology of corrosive community events. And, like, this comes out of the nuclear work. These experiences that end up really, like, eroding the base of community capital, because they are toxic experiences, not in terms of, like, the chemicals, but in terms of the kind of relations that emerge out of them. So I think this is really trenchant and important. And of course, it's happening all over, not only in energy impacted communities, but it's a big dilemma for, like, if you require people to submit their own data to you for your work to be successful, what are we going to do about that? It's a huge problem.
And you mentioned that, you have to successfully share your research. I'm wondering if you could just provide some concrete examples of ways that you've shared your results and ways that you've shared ongoing research. In what form have you presented them, and what has been and has not been successful?
Yeah, I'm happy. I can start, and Julia, you can pick up where I left off, which is, we try to follow the lead of the communities in which we've been doing the research. So we ask, how do you want a presentation at the library? Do you want a presentation in front of a county commission? Do you want to meet at your kitchen table and chat about it? We've also drafted, executive summaries of our longer reports so that they have, a short 2-pager that's really, visually interesting. I've, in my work since being at Montana State, I made a story map, which is, through ArcGIS, an interactive, story map, which is web-based, shares content along with maps, figures, photographs. I will say, the success has been all over the map. You send out the executive summaries, you hope people read them. You're not sure if they do, but you've done what you said you were going to do, and sharing it and making it available to them. I remember one time in Wyoming, we had a a November meeting scheduled to share back the results. And Julie and I drove there in a snowstorm and nobody came. And that was less successful, but we were there. And, you know, sometimes things happen that you can't control, but those are some of the things we've done, but remain open-minded to new ideas.
Yeah, I don't know that we're not like, we have not rocked this one, you know, and I still see this like happening. So for me, it goes to the relationality piece. Like, what matters less to me is like the specific moment we shared things, but the fact that I know that people in that community know my name and my phone number. So when this comes back up, and it does, I'll get invited to go to the neighborhood association meeting, or I'll get invited to, you know, go to the county commission meeting, just because of that relationship that exists. You know, we've had project newsletters, we've had, you know, different approaches to doing that. It feels like when the issue is really hot, you know, there's a permitting decision or something, that there'll be a lot of energy around it, and then it just will die down. So I think keeping those relationships is good, but I'm sure there's also like many more creative ways to do it. And all of them take time. All of them take, you know, a lot of resources, but I think they are successful when they're built on human relationships, you know, like actual interpersonal relationships.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question, and this is a question that could potentially plant some seeds for future research for those doing research in the audience. So the question is, with current spikes in energy prices and pressures brought on by the Ukraine war, we're also seeing a significant uptick in drilling and production. Are research funders identifying that and being proactive and thinking about what, if any, social or other research should be undertaken? Or do you think funders will sort of miss the boat and lag the actual events?
That is a great question. I haven't been on a review panel in the last few months, so I'm not sure what's coming over the pike. Dan, I think I can't answer that question for funders. My hunch is that, to the extent that this, you know, that this could produce a lasting uptick in, you know, pressure for development. I think many people work in the shale space have now worked on, you know, the new facilities, which are like some fossil, you know, LNG and pipeline stuff, really working on utility scale, like renewables and how that creates community impact. So they might be a little bit distracted. And I think that's a good question. But I haven't seen any calls for taking this seriously.
Okay, well, thank you both. It has been extremely illuminating and hopefully really helpful for those in the audience who do research in environmental health and boom towns and anything that might involve communities. I just want to thank all of our participants here for attending. We're going to link to our website in the chat here, including our spatial bibliography for those that are interested in learning more about the research that we've been collecting. And Julia and Katie, I want to shout you out, give you a special thanks for organizing this webinar and speaking and providing your tools and insights about research fatigue.
It's great to be here.
And please keep us updated on your work.
Yeah, likewise. So great to be here. And if anyone in the audience, you know, has specific questions, please do feel free to follow up with either of us. So it was a pleasure to see everyone. Sorry we couldn't meet everyone in the audience, but look forward to keeping in touch.
Great. Thanks all.
Cheers.